kind of compelled you to decide to look into this further or to design a study to understand what exactly was going on?
Right. And as my career passed, I really got quite active in my science and at fairly senior levels, actually early on at the national level, being on expert panels and things like that, policy making. And I kept seeing things all the time that I found very troubling. And I would ask myself, why is this bothering me and not bothering others? And when I tried to do some, if you will, introspection, why do I think the way I think? I often came back to the farm. I would come back, this doesn't sound natural to me, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the first questions I took a course at Cornell when I first went there about in nutritional biochemistry. And one of the major illustrations was, this nutrient does that, another nutrient does something else. And
mm-hmm.
there was a big project at Cornell at the time involving 4 nutrients as it impacted, a disease in chickens and calves of all things.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember each one of those 4 things did something specific. And when you kind of mix those nutrients together, then something different happened.
Right.
So I asked my professor, I remember at the time, I was just a classroom. I was just asking a simple question, but as I look back, it stuck in my brain because I said to him, well, why don't we study that this way? He said, we can't. It's not possible.
Right. In other words, the idea of taking a more macro approach and a more global perspective as opposed to this very reductionist.
Exactly. So that was sort of lesson number 1 in a sense,
mm-hmm.
as far as the science was concerned, that things are far more complicated than just thinking about going from A to B to go to C and so
mm-hmm.
forth. So our biochemical research, when I got involved in that, and I was lucky to get quite substantial amounts of funding from the very beginning, and it continued from NIH.
From NIH, right.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so we had a big research program, actually. I had a lot of graduate students, and I had the freedom to be able to ask questions, design experiments, see what it might look like. And anytime you learn something new, you always have more questions.
Right.
So that was the way it went, and it just kind of drifted in a certain direction. But the more, I just found myself just asking questions that were a little bit offbeat, I guess, because I was just curious. I
mm-hmm.
liked the science. And pretty soon, things started to fall together, and I realized there was a much bigger story here than just working on one single thing at a time.
Mm-hmm. But to bring it back to the specifics of the China study, could you just describe the essence of what that was?
Yeah, by the time the China study opportunity came along, and this was in the early 1980s, I got an opportunity it was a letter sent to Cornell by the first senior scientist from China to come to the United States, and this particular gentleman, Dr. Zhen Shenshu, he had come from a famous family in China, actually. In any case, he was one of the first to come to this country. He was looking for a place to land, spend some time. His government had given him
mm-hmm.
this opportunity. And he was sent to Cornell a little bit, and some others turned it down. I don't know why, but I grabbed onto him right away, and mm-hmm. so he came and worked with me. And it was probably one of the best decisions I ever made, because it turned out he really was from a well-connected family in China, for starters, and high up in the government, in a sense, as far as science is concerned. And so at that time, the Chinese government had done this nationwide survey of how much cancer existed across a total of something like 2,400 counties.
Mm-hmm.
It was a massive undertaking. And what they were able to show was that cancer was very common in some counties and not in others. So it was common sense just to ask, well, what about, what's causing this unusual concentration of cancer in certain places for about a dozen different cancers? So we got together, and I said, why don't we try to get an application to do some funding there? His government was offering a lot of support in kind.
Mm-hmm.
We needed capital, so I went back to NIH again to see if I could get that funding, and we did. We had the first project between the United States and China, the first
mm-hmm.
research project at that time. So we went there and surveyed a large population. That was an opportunity for me to see if, in fact, the kind of information we might learn from that population was consistent with these rather aberrant questions that I was getting in the laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
And that had to do
with... And those questions were?
Those questions were basically that animal protein in particular, was promoting cancer, because that's what we learned in the laboratory. And we did that and measured just a huge amount of
It was a
information.
massive undertaking. I
It
mean,
was a
how many
massive
people
undertaking.
did it take to sort of collect the data from this gigantic population of individuals?
Well, it wasn't so big in terms of numbers of people. It was 6,500 adults, plus their families. So we estimated around 10, 11,000 people, which in those days, it was big, but it wasn't that big, really. What made it big was the number of variables that we were looking at. And I wanted to be able to analyze for just anything and everything, because I really was getting interested in this idea that there's more to this story, as we generally do in science, than just one thing at a time.
So the ideas that you're discussing in your more recent book, Whole, these are already formulated and taking place in the China study, because I think it would have been very easy for you to simply say, we're going to look at animal protein and liver cancer, and that's all we're looking at, and we don't need to look at anything else. And nobody would have batted an eye. That is reductionist science 101. That's the way we do it. And you could have gone on your way with that and dismissed with this idea of entertaining the possibility that an innumerable number of other variables could be contributing or having causative or correlative effects with the results that you were seeing.
Yeah, actually, we proposed for that grant application, by the way, exactly something like that. We wanted to look at the relationship between the mineral selenium and its relationship to a heart disease in children. That's why, in part, I got the grant, because it was focused. At the same time, we were kind of fortunate in a way, because there were parties interested in the United States in getting involved in China, and vice versa. So for some political support, I was able to get it that way, but it was focused on one thing.
And so describe what you began to learn when you assayed this population across all these variables.
Well, we ended up with collecting 367 items of information, as I would say, things measured in the blood, the urine, the food, questions being asked. And so we had a big collection of a lot of variables, if you will. We worked on each one to make sure they're reliable. We had ways of doing that. And then they were all correlated with each other, so we ended up with about 100,000 correlations, about 9,000 of which were statistically significant. To be expected, that's just a random chance of that happening. But in any case, we wanted to take those significant correlations and some others that might approach significance to see if there were patterns. I should say, incidentally, it was directed by me at Cornell University, but I was able to access some fantastic colleagues at the University of Oxford. Richard Peto, Sir Richard Peto now, Sir Richard Dahl, some very eminent epidemiologists, and others in China, some of the senior scientists there, and plus another 24 laboratories around the world.
And so what were some of the most significant, statistically significant correlations that you began to uncover?
Well, it really, coming back to the question concerning animal protein, I mean, that had been a lifelong or career-long question, because we were able to, in the prior studies, we were able to show that we could turn on and turn off cancer just simply by feeding, of all things, the protein of cow's milk, which brought me back to the dairy farm in a sense. And that was very provocative, to say the least.
And I think it's, there might be a perspective out there that you were out to, sort of prove, to establish an objective that you already believed in. But you're coming from this dairy farm background, and it had been your whole, the conviction of your entire upbringing that, milk does a body good, that this is the perfect food, right? So where did you start to begin to see kind of cracks in the firmament of that concept?
Well, it was the initial observation I think we did with there were some Indian researchers who had done some laboratory animal studies that showed that at the time that I was in the Philippines, but they didn't believe what they got. It was published in an obscure journal, but I kind of believed it because it was consistent with what I was seeing with the children. And so as we went into that research, we looked at it in great depth, and I had become convinced by that time, we did it so many different ways that animal protein actually increases cancer risk, period. And so I was really interested to know in the China study whether there was any evidence for that. And my bias was to find the opposite.
Right.
Really was. I mean, if I had a prejudice,
that's a very important point. I think that you weren't out to sort of be on this crusade with this foregone conclusion that you already had in your mind. You went out and you surveyed a gigantic population of people across innumerable variables and remained open-minded. And to take what you just said, hopeful that maybe it might prove the opposite.
That's right. Absolutely. I was always kind of swimming upstream against my own sort of prior prejudices. But finally, the evidence was overwhelming with respect to, for starters, with the effect of animal protein on encouraging the development of cancers, if you will. But then there were other questions that arose, too, at the same time. And always having this doubt, about the significance of this, I would want to ask broader questions. What if we eat animal protein-containing foods? What about all the other nutrients that come along with it? What's happening there? Do they cancel each other? So we started investigating other nutrients, other cancers, other diseases. And the more that I looked, the more consistent became the data. Everything seemed to, all the nutrients in animal-based foods as opposed to all the nutrients in plant-based foods, they seemed to be doing opposite things. And their activities were sort of mutually supportive, at the biochemical and physiological level. So the story became, for me, even ever more impressive. But it was always coming from a position, in my case, in a sense, of almost trying to disprove, what I had observed.
And this is a landmark discovery, right? This had never been sort of established or presumed or even conjured by anyone prior to you.
It's an interesting question, and I'll comment on it in just a minute. But yes, when we were doing all the research in the laboratory, and because of my skepticism about a lot of things, what we ended up discovering were a lot of fundamental ideas that were against the rules, against what I was teaching and against what was in the books.
Such as?
Well, for example, turning cancer on and off by nutritional means. I mean, that was a big deal. And it turned out we didn't do it just with protein and liver cancer. We also did it with dietary fat and pancreatic cancer and things like this. So that phenomenon of thinking about the causation of cancer and later other diseases as a result of simply modifying, nutrient intake and the idea of actually reversing disease.
Right. It's the turning off
part. We were
part.
reversing disease.
Yeah.
And cancer, I thought, this is incredible. And so we were learning other things too, like that the relationship between nutrition and genes. A lot of people think, and a lot of people still think, that somehow genes predetermine whether or not we're going to get a certain kind of disease. And what we are showing, no, it's not the case. We can have the genes to cause it, to start the initiation of events, but we can control it by nutritional means. Big thing. Another one, sort of principle, like, if you will, like protein. It causes cancer, let's say, for starters. One of the things that I was really being pushed to do to prove my point was to find what the mechanism was. Which enzyme, which that. And so we started looking for the mechanisms. And I had a series of PhD students spending 4 or 5 years, each of them looking at a mechanism. And it turned out there is no such thing. So that was another myth that I was all of a sudden running across too. And so a lot of the things that we learned really were, I think, the result of my skepticism.
And it's quite astounding. I mean, I think people can inherently wrap their brain around the idea of prevention, like doing certain things, whether through diet or, exercise or what have you, to prevent certain things from happening. But when you start talking about reversal once onset has begun, that starts to get into radical territory.
Really radical territory. Because the whole medical profession is, in a sense, is sort of supported by the idea that somehow you're going to be able to, if you have a disease or about to start, or it's already there, you're going to cure it. That's sort of the premise. And that's the territory of the practice of medicine.
Right.
What we were saying, what I thought we were saying, I'm very excited about this idea that this formula, this nutritional formula for preventing the production of future disease also works to treat existing disease. That's the future of this field. Just the whole idea you could take this with people with disease or a very high risk of disease and treat them.
Right. And so you're drawing these conclusions, these statistically significant correlations, and there's a decision at some point that this should not just reside in a medical journal, but that this should be shared more broadly through a book, right? So where does the idea of a book come in, and how does that all come about?
Well, from about the late 1970s until, let's say, 1990, I was getting into more and more trouble, if you will, by raising these provocative questions, getting results to show things that were rather different.
Right.
And I was a subject of pretty intense scrutiny, to say the least, from my colleagues. But I was still succeeding in getting all the money I wanted. I had senior positions in my society and the government.
So the NIH is smiling down on you throughout this whole
things
thing.
were going great. But finally, it became apparent that I was supporting an idea that I never expected I would arrive at in the early 1990s. When we got the results from the China study, it supported what we had been doing in the laboratory. New York Times got a hold of it. Jane Brody, one of the leading people writing at that time for the Times, a graduate of Cornell too, she came up to interview me. She wrote the article. It came out in the New York Times as the lead article in the science section. And the headline in it said something like, this is the Grand Prix of all studies. It establishes this, that, or something else. Very provocative. And it made me nervous. Because by this time, I'm in the science establishment, right? You don't go out and say these crazy things. And so here are the times I put it in headline. I had to say to myself,
you're losing control of this story.
Yeah, it's getting out there. And, I didn't mind it really getting out there, sharing it with the public to some extent. But this was really provocative. New York Times. And I saw that, and I picked up the phone. I called Jane. I said, Jane, why did you put that title up there like that? I said, this is pretty outrageous. And she said, I didn't do it. She said, the editors did it. I said, oh, okay. So it was out there by that time. So I came home and asked my wife. I remember this very well. She does too. I said, are you willing to live in a double wide? Because I figured, even I said, I had the senior position at Cornell, the topmost position. Actually, I had an endowed chair. I was, and all that sort of thing. And I knew that I was about to take a big hit, one way or another. And she said, of course. And it was. I don't know why you asked that. I just wanted to confirm it with her.
You could start stockpiling guns and hunker down.
I was driven as she was. I mean, as I go back, and my background is very simple. We were raised on a farm. My wife similarly was that way. No education, upper level education for her family or for mine. And I only could rely on one thing, and that was the truth. And so I get that from my father, who had a great reputation as a farmer in the area, great integrity. He said, when you go out, always tell the truth. It was that simple. It was a hard-nosed thing. And I just thought, there's no other way. So I obviously put my toe in the water and kept on going. And I can't turn back, because then it only becomes bigger and bigger. The China study itself was a book. I was complaining to my wife a little bit about this. The arrows coming my way were becoming more and more intense. So finally she said, well, why don't you write a book? So I said, okay, well, we will. But I kept putting it off, and then she was getting a little more annoyed with time. And I got a couple of offers from book publishers in the early 90s that if I'd write a book, and that came from the New York Times article, if I'd write a book, in one case, the guy offered me $1 million to write a book, and he wanted to call it The China Diet. And I didn't want to do that, because I thought that was corrupting the message. And so he went back and back to New York and actually wrote the first chapter and wrote the outline, and everything came back. He says, I'll guarantee you $1 million if you write this book. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it for money. That was not the purpose. And so that just sort of sat there for a while, and from 92 or 3 or so until 2002, when I finally sat down and insisted to my wife, you better write that book, she said. It's for the women and the children of the world for no other reason, and tell my story. So I started writing a book with my youngest son, who's now a physician, without understanding exactly where this thing was going to go. And all I wanted to do was just see if I couldn't summarize for myself a story that made sense.
Right.
That was all it was. And we did say in the later part of the book that you don't have to believe all this science. I said to the reader, just try it.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's kind of an amazing thing to pass up, $1 million so that you could write a book the way that you wanted to write it and tell the story appropriately without inflammation or trying to sort of frame the narrative in the context of a diet that people could purchase.
Right. Yeah, it was. And then actually after we did the China study, we had the manuscript ready to go. We were shopping it around. I had engaged 3 other agents prior to that. Finally landed on one that was a good agent. I thought that's the way to go. I didn't know anything about the publishing business. But in any case, this guy had been senior vice president at Random House.
Mm-hmm.
So he wanted to represent us, and he shopped around to 11 different publishers or manuscript. And a couple of them offered advances, and I didn't want the advances because the story that they all wanted, they were all consistent on a couple of points. They looked at it and they said, we don't need all these references, and the public doesn't want to have all these references, number one. They wanted to dumb it down to a 10-year-old. That was
get rid of the science column.
Yeah, get rid of this stuff. And then they also wanted me to put, 60 to 70% of the book with recipes. I said, I don't even know where the pots and pans are in the kitchen, let alone recipes. So, that's not what I want to do. And it's not about the money. So I remember a couple of occasions, I won't go into details here, where they were really insisting I was doing the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. And finally, we had the last meeting with the senior vice president at the company where this agent had come from. And he had to straighten my tie up and everything else and tell me how to talk. And, he thought, this is a winner, that we're going to go in and have this opportunity to meet a senior person at Random House. We got in there, and she started saying things. I started talking about, the grander scheme of things and how things work together. No, that's not possible. They had published the Okinawa diet, I think it was. Mm-hmm. Oh, she said, are you saying that there's the same message for all these different diseases? I said, yes. That's not possible. She got really quite angry. And so I was arguing with it. My agent, in turn, got annoyed. He thought he was going to have a big one. He got up and left us.
Right,
because I had blown the lid.
No big advance from
Random
House.
They both said, you okay, do the book. You're not going to sell more than 3,000 to 5,000 copies at the most. Mm-hmm. They might just put it in libraries as standard stuff. So we walked away from 11 publishers.
Wow! Just
because of what they wanted to do,
so they weren't saying no. They just wanted to
direct what I was going to do.
Exactly.
So I didn't want to do it. So finally went to a small publisher who allowed us to do what we wanted to do. Mm-hmm. Even he said, you're not going to sell more than 5,000 or 10,000. Finally he said, if you can sell 15,000, I think it was 15,000 to 18,000, he said, I'll be happy, I'll cover my costs. Mm-hmm. He said, but he was just hoping that we could sell that. Well, now it's well over 1 million, so made us company.
That's amazing. It's exceeded 1 million?
Yeah,
Wow,
well over 1 million.
That is incredible.
But 25 languages, foreign languages.
Wow.
So it's getting around.
But it didn't start out that way. Just in sitting down with Howard, he told this amazing story.
Well, Howard wasn't involved in the China.
No, I know, but he was sort of recounting the early days of, when the China study initially came out and how he was the third person to review the book. It was 7 weeks after it had come out. And I just presumed that, when it came out big and strong and fast, and that was not the case. Like, it took a while before anybody was paying attention, and your little publisher actually was sort of right in the first few weeks or these early days after publication.
Yeah, I saw on Amazon where these reviews are written. Obviously I'm looking at that. It's all new to me,
Yeah.
And this brilliant review came out, supporting the study. And I saw this guy's name, Howard Jacobson, and I thought, I think I know him, because prior to that, Howard had met someone else, so I thought it was true, and of course it turned out.
Well, you have a bear trap memory, because Howard claims that he stood in line amongst 7 other people to meet you at the Veg Source event, and couldn't
Maybe so.
imagine how you could possibly remember meeting him. But that's
Well, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I met him through another person by the name of John Allen Mulliner.
oh, maybe that's the case. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
In any case, we had a short meeting, obviously, but clearly it became the person that I thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
And so that review stayed on the Amazon site throughout just about the entire history of the 10 years.
Right. If
it's been
you're
out there.
one of the early reviewers, good or bad, those reviews tend to stay at the top.
That's right.
You know, once it really starts to cascade.
Unfortunately, that was a good review.
Yeah, it's good. You're lucky.
Very well written.
Yeah.
Very positive.
But where was the moment where it kind of tipped the scales in terms of getting out into the public? I mean, was there one thing that occurred that kind of changed
Yes,
things in terms of getting the book out there?
There are certain individuals. Gary Player, the pro golfer, called me up right after it came out, and he said, "I'm Gary Player." I couldn't believe that I was talking to Gary Player, but he said that he was going to be on the Golf Channel with a big audience and wanted to know if he could talk about it. I said, help yourself. It's great. It's fantastic. He told me what it's going to do. He said, I'm going to get down on my knees and just talk about this book. I mean, he was really impressed with it, I guess. And so, in fact, we watched to see when this happened. I was actually, by this time, with Howie, Dr. Jacobson. And so we watched Gary Player get down and, with a praying position, and it says, America, everyone in this country should read this book, or something like that. That was a good hit.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That was pretty good. And then Bill Clinton.
No publicist is going to get you that.
No, and then Bill Clinton came along.
Yeah, how
too,
does Bill Clinton come into the equation? Because this is fascinating.
Well, this is about 3 years after the book was out, and I was on the board with a close friend of Bill Clinton's, former governor of North Carolina, Jim Hunt.
The board of what?
No, of a company that my son and I had founded.
Oh, okay.
And so Jim Hunt was on there, the chief. Actually, we had some pretty key figures on there, but Jim Hunt, the former governor of North Carolina, was there. He, in turn, was a close friend of Clinton. So Jim came and asked me if I signed a couple copies for Clinton. So I did. I got a handwritten note back from President Clinton, thanking me for the book, and he didn't follow up for a couple of years, and it wasn't until the time of his daughter's wedding,
right,
that he had another problem with his heart, and she in turn, the story goes, that she in turn wanted him to do the book, and so he got pretty enthused about it. And I got a call from one of his close associates who was at the wedding, and said that Clinton had come to the wedding and was carrying the book with him. That's what I was told. And I heard this before the CNN thing came along, but he had the book with him. He was showing it to everybody, including Barbara Streisand, who wanted to know, what is that book you keep on talking about? This is second information before the CNN thing. And so he told her, and her husband allegedly said, second information again, said to her, I got that book for you 2 years ago and you never read it. So these kind of stories, I was getting these stories, and finally then he's on CNN.
And this is the Wolf Blitzer interview,
Wolf
right?
Blitzer,
Prior, there was the Last Heart Attack show with Sanjay Gupta, but I remember that Wolf Blitzer interview where he talked about wanting to be healthy for his daughter's wedding.
Yeah, it was. And he got really good results, and became a real enthusiast for this idea. Yeah, it's true.
That's amazing. And then where in the timeline does Forks Over Knives come into the equation?
At about that same time, and let's say I think about 2009, possibly. This is 4 years after the book had been published. A young fellow in California had attended one of my lectures. This fellow, having some resources, decided that he really loved it, and so forth and so on. And I recommended that he also talk to my friend Esselstyn, because in the book I knew Esselstyn. He hadn't at that time really had too much attention. So we went and interviewed him partly for the book, as you know, and others. And so I recommended he go hear him too. He did. And the next thing, he wants to get together and put a film out. And he said he wanted to get the best possible director and and producer, and he introduced me to them and wanted to get me to confirm the possibility of making a film, based on starting out at least with the China study. That's where it started. And so I wasn't involved in any of that planning, certainly not in the resources or the return or anything like that. I haven't gotten any financial return out of it.
Right.
So I have no equity position in any of that stuff. But he followed us, the crew followed us to China, to Washington, to all over the place, back to my farm, the farm we had when I was a kid. And so they went ahead and did the film. And of course, that film has turned out to be pretty fabulous.
Quite amazing, yeah. And in talking about it with Howard, I don't think anybody could have predicted what a phenomenon it has become. I think it was maybe it still is, I'm not sure, but for a very long time, it was the number one, watched documentary on Netflix, or the number one selling documentary on Amazon, or I don't know exactly what the statistics are, but phenomenal impact that movie has had.
It has.
And what's interesting about it is it's not just about plant-based nutrition, the findings of the China study, Dr. Esselstyn's remarkable work with reversing heart disease through plant-based nutrition. I mean, when you see these angiograms, the before and after, it's so compelling. But it's also about this amazing friendship that you have had for many years with Dr. Esselstyn. And it sort of begs the question of, sitting where you're sitting now, having devoted, both yourself and Dr. Esselstyn having devoted the better part of your lives to this quest and this message that you're putting out, for so many years, having it fall on deaf ears or being criticized or being maligned, to now having sort of the sort of audience or reception that maybe you thought initially you might get right out of the gate. How does that feel? I mean, does that give you a sense of vindication? Or maybe that's a little bit of a negative word, but it's been a long road. I mean, you and Essie have been at this for a very long time, and it's taken an extremely long time for the momentum to pick up to the point where people are now receptive and hearing it, and it's become this thing. It's become this movement.
Yeah, obviously I'm very gratified, that this is happening. And as time passes, it becomes deeper and deeper in meaning it for me. And it relates more than just, working with the biochemistry, inside of cancer cells, if you will. And obviously it's led to, the possibility of writing another book, as you know, and at that time, when I first started to write the second book that eventually got called Whole, I had in mind, the first title was using the word control. Because for me, I'd had a lot of experiences, a lot of kickback, from institutions and other people about this crazy path I was on. And it was very discouraging at times, but I couldn't turn around. And so I spent 3 weeks at a resort, not a resort, but a beach house down before we started to write Whole. It's called Control. And I started out just documenting all of these ridiculous experiences that I had, the lies, that existed in policy and all this sort of stuff. And I wrote about 60 pages, in that period of time, and I was going to document it that way. And all of a sudden it struck me, this is really stupid. Why am I talking about all this horrendous kickback? It made no sense. And so I said, well, forget that. So I decided to go back and write a book that was more positive, trying to understand, rather than talk about all the negative stuff coming my way.
Right. I mean, it would kind of come off as sour grapes.
That's right. Exactly. And I just didn't have any taste for that whatsoever. I wanted to write something just asking myself, is there something about this idea that's missing from our work in science? And the more I thought about it, and I started out with to define 3 words: nutrition, medicine, health. I didn't know how I was going to define it, but I knew it wasn't what I was teaching and had been teaching over the years and stuff like this, and our research didn't show that. And the reductionist idea had been mentioned in the China study, so that was there. But then I didn't know how to describe the rest of it, so I found out it's holism and something like that. And I wanted to spell it out. I went to 3 dictionaries to learn. I was going to spell it WHOLISM.
Mm-hmm.
It always has been spelled HOLISM. And I thought I'd find an alternative spelling. I couldn't find it.
Right.
And so then I decided, I'm going to create my own word here, put the W in front, parentheses around it, and call it holism. And then I got into reading as a total amateur, in the history of a little bit of religion, if you will, the ancient Greek times and stuff like that, and got some ideas. And the more I thought about the concept, I thought, holy man, this is pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Because it really just all of a sudden is like a step into a new world, new paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Almost taking a step beyond holistic into the WH holism, and the idea of taking this global view of understanding and embracing the idea of the incredible complexity of nutrition, diet, biochemistry, human physiology, and an appreciation, I think, for how difficult it is to draw conclusions from a reductionist approach.
Right.
Is that fair to say?
It's very fair to say. In fact, now I'm really kind of immersed in the idea of really challenging the whole concept of what we regard as science. I mean, science is in the biological world, in the medical world, so-called science, it's largely reductionist. Of course, we all know that. It's caused a lot of harm, a lot of difficulties. But I understand the need to do reductionist research because that's what I was involved in too in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But it's sort of the threads of the tapestry. Everybody can work on their own thread, and make a big deal out of it, what the tapestry might look like, but they have no clue.
How these
except for
threads
what's in their imagination.
How these threads impact each other.
Yeah, so it's only, by putting all these threads together do we begin to see something new and something exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of like that metaphor as much as any other.
So how do we move in a new direction with this? I mean, what is the solution? I mean, I would presume that you still maintain that a reductionist approach is appropriate in certain circumstances for certain purposes.
Sure.
But how do we take this newfound idea that you're proposing and implement that into a better way of approaching science?
Well, reductionist research, I don't want to come back off, as actually being opposed to reductionist research. Mm-hmm. I'm certain I'm not. Because we have to have the threads to make the tapestry. That's fair enough. And I'm glad there are reductionist scientists building my airplanes that I ride on, or building my computers. Right. I want them to be precise. I want them to be just doing the best they possibly can as they put that together. But in biology and medicine, all one needs to do is go look at the cell. Between whatever it is, 10 to 100 trillion cells we have in our body. Just look inside of one of those cells and see this extraordinary complexity, which in itself, every cell is just virtually almost like our universe. It's the microcosmos, it's the macrocosmos, if you will, and see this enormous integrity that occurs and symphony that occurs within the cell. And that's, for me, in a nutshell, of what this is all really all about. And as to where we go with this in the future, I think experiential is a really big thing. People have to simply try it, like we said in the China study. You don't have to believe me, just try it. Mm-hmm. And that. And
so what is it that they're trying? What is
well,
it that
just eating a whole food plant-based diet.
Right, okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Without adding back the oil, the fat, and the sugar that they've become accustomed to. Just eating the whole food plant-based diet. It's an awkward term. Mm-hmm. It's not exactly veganism or vegetarianism because they come up short, in this. But nonetheless, they were going in the right direction. And we now know, and thanks to my friend Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Ornish and some others who were...
Dr. Furman, Dr. Greger, Dr. Clapper.
Yeah, especially, but it's Esselstyn, really. It's Esselstyn
right.
and Ornish. And Dr. Clapper, yeah. There's... and what I got really enthused about their work, as much as anything else, it confirmed what we had been doing in animals, reversing cancer, which is just about the furthest thing one could have in their mind, reverse it by nutritional means. I mean, that really kind of sealed the deal for me in many ways, that biologically speaking, we were turning cancer on and off by nutritional means, and we were doing it by multiple sort of holistic sort of approach in that sense, and controlling genes in the process. That's all those so-called principles that I had worked on years ago. All of a sudden, it come to light, and when Dr. Esselstyn called me after the New York Times article, and then I found out what he was doing. Dr.
He's
McDougall
covering
did
the
the same thing.
the heart disease aspect.
Yeah, I said, geez, you're doing exactly. And he did his thing from his perspective, and it was really nice. We came to the same place.
Right. Yeah,
You know,
it's beautifully orchestrated.
Yeah.
We're running out of time, and I could spend the entire afternoon taking up all of your time. And you've been very gracious to spend this time with us. But I wanted to. I think I would be remiss if I didn't raise the issue of the critiques of the China study, the sort of dismissals that are out there. And there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast that are coming from different kinds of nutritional protocols. And you go online, it's very easy to be confused, and there's conflicting opinions, and it can kind of create a paralysis in terms of what to do. And like many things in life, something comes out that's new and revolutionary, and it takes a while for it to come into the mainstream, and then it's celebrated, and human nature is to then, after 5 minutes later, let's see if we can pull this down and attack it. And there are certain contingents out there that have proposed that the China study has been debunked. It's like become this popular thing. Well, didn't you hear the China study has been debunked? And I'm interested in how you weather those kind of comments and what your response to that is.
Well, first off, I should point out those people who are writing this kind of information have no training in science, in nutritional science. Number one, they no experience to doing the kind of experimentation. They don't publish. They're not being held accountable for their words. They can say anything they want to say. In science, we develop some evidence, and if it's going to be worthy of consideration, we publish it. And it's being reviewed by peers. And we don't publish it if it doesn't pass that muster. And my work was reviewed extensively. First off, in actually competing for funding. Only 1 of every 6 applications gets funding. And we just continued to get funding for 27 years for that one project. I had a lot of success in getting funding. And so I had a pretty good name, actually, in the scientific world for doing good science. Then when you publish, and I have over 300 and some publications that were peer reviewed, so I'm held accountable for my words, let me tell you, even by my critics. These people writing this stuff have nothing, none of that. That's a very important point to make. Good writers, great writers, but they don't have this background. They can say anything they want to say, and they say just totally untruthful things. But if we come down, there's a couple of observations that the people who have all these Atkins-like diets, if you will, and paleo diet and all those books, different names, different authors, different times, they're all basically the same thing. They're all talking about a low-carb diet. That's become the mantra of the day. Well, since plants are the only kind of foods essentially that have carbohydrates, really serious amounts of carbohydrates in them, this really has been an attack on the recommendation we should be consuming vegetables, fruits, and grains as a means of health from the very beginning. I mean, Atkins came out in '73 with their first book. That was following the McGovern thing that, said eat less animal food. So the low-carb diet, the better name for that, they should be called a high-protein, high-fat diet. And there is no evidence, I find no evidence in scientific literature anyplace else that you can actually take that kind of diet and treat and reverse disease. It's simply
that's the one thing that always brings me back to a whole food plant-based diet is that it is the only protocol that I'm aware of that actually has had significant success reversing illness. And I don't think any other protocol can make that claim. And suddenly, in recent years, it's become very vogue to talk about grass-fed meats and putting butter in your coffee and the supposed cholesterol myth and fat is not your enemy and all of these sorts of things. And I'm mystified. I'm mystified as to how this could suddenly be the case. I mean, every cardiologist I've spoken to, every medical practitioner that I respect does not adhere to these to these ideas that are out there. And I don't know whether there is some science to support something that I'm not understanding, or whether people just want to hear good news about their bad habits. But what is your perspective on that?
Well, it's always possible, since they're not being held accountable for their own sort of interpretations, if you will. They're able to choose rather reductionist kinds of ideas and thread it together to make it sound like a halfway decent story at times. Some of them can. And the Good Calories, Bad Calories is one such book, where the writer is a good science writer, good journalist, but he pulls from the literature, observations of various sundry kinds, pulls it together, makes it sound like a reasonable story. Mm-hmm. So it's used in reductionist science in that sort of fashion. But the point is that, as I say, they cannot treat people with disease and get they can, some of these diets, of course, lead to some loss of body weight. In the beginning, that's pretty consistent. That's one thing. And to some extent, the blood cholesterol has come down a bit too. Mm-hmm. But in reality, with the passage of some time, most of them drop off the wagon, don't continue it, from some short-term, adverse effects. Mm-hmm. But in the long term, no one can tell me that they can find societies or large groups of people who are consuming a high-protein, high-fat diet for all their lives and seeing lower rates of cancer.
But Dr. Campbell, don't you know about the Inuits?
The Inuits
always seem to come up.
Well, the Inuits, of course, are the people who tend to die early for starters. Mm-hmm. And the major cause of death is trauma. So they don't quite live into the period when they might get problems. But there has been research showing, in fact, that their problems are not quite so severe as much, given how much protein and fat they presumably consumed. It's not all what it's claimed to be.
Well, I suppose that they may be a genetic outlier also, because they've adapted in a certain environment and in isolation for many years. I mean, there could be, but it's such a statistically insignificant. I mean, it's such a small group of people. But there seems to be an inordinate amount of focus on that particular community, as opposed to the planet at large.
All right. Well, there's another group that's a better illustration, I think, and this is the Maasai in Africa, who blood, meat, and milk. Right, that's their lives. Mm-hmm. It's often said they don't have any problems. Their cholesterol levels are low, and they don't have any heart disease, and so forth and so on. It turns out the principal person who was first reporting this so-called low cholesterol levels, actually in 1973, when he went back and had a chance to examine 50 Maasais who had died otherwise, he just wrote in his conclusion, all these men had atherosclerosis equal to that of old American men. Mm. So they actually do not, in fact, have the really low cholesterol levels. Don't have the effects of atherosclerosis. This is the man who first told. This often gets quoted. George Mann was his name. As telling about the Maasai having these remarkable health advantages. Mm-hmm. But in '73, he published something quite the opposite. So to explain this, in a sense, they actually are able to, apparently, they exercise, just inordinate amounts of exercise, obviously, something like yourself. Right. And so the exercise plays a big role. And they actually are able to form this collateral vascular network around some of these lesions, possibly. And so they're able to survive and extend, and do quite well in this for some period of time. They don't live again to that age where we can really get good data on that point. But it's the story about the Maasai and those kinds of people. Oftentimes you go back and really check to see what evidence is being used. Mm-hmm. This was sort of a citation of some early literature that, somebody made some observations that weren't reliably examined. Right. Certainly it's true with the Maasai. And I had the first Maasai student to come to the West to do a doctorate. She came to work with me at Cornell. I gave her some money to go back, and her father had been a doctor, I guess a traditional doctor in the Maasai group. And so I asked her to go and collect some more information, to see, because I wanted to know more what they were really eating. And of course, she came back and they were eating a lot more tubers and roots like that than had previously been reported. And then I happened to also be friendly, got to know one of the Leakeys, the wife of one of the Leakey sons, who lived in the midst of that group for 20 years. And when I was talking to her about that, and that's where she says they spent 20 years of her life in the Maasai tribal region. She said that their claim that they only eat meat, milk, and eggs is not true.
Interesting.
They do eat a lot. I mean, that's very clear.
Right, but
And,
more gathering in agrarian.
They do
than
certainly
maybe
do some
earlier
gathering.
Presumed. Interesting.
But that's the limit of my knowledge. I can't tell too much more about that.
Right. All right, well, we got to wrap this up, but I want you to tell us a little bit before we go about this new movie project that's underway.
Yeah, the Force of Knives has had great success. My oldest son has actually engaged the services of the director of Force of Knives, Lee Fulkerson, and also one of the co-producers of Force of Knives, John Corey, quite an experienced fellow himself.
Right, I know John.
Do you know John? Yeah, I'm very impressed with John and with Lee, and they both are excited about what's happening here. I can't tell too much at this point in time, where actually there's one event in particular that's going to set it apart. It's happening right now where we're sitting here talking today.
You're such a tease. You're teasing us.
No, I'm not teasing you. I'm not teasing you. I just got an email this morning. I can't wait until
You're
tonight.
in a gag order. Oh,
Because
okay.
I can't say. All I can say is I'm enthusiastic for what this is turning out to be, because Force of Knives was sort of telling the public, here's some information that's kind of useful and which you might use in your lives and so forth and so on. It became very popular, but it didn't really answer the question why. Why hasn't this not been told before? This goes to that question. And it goes right to the heart of it. I can't imagine
Not been told in the sense of why has it been so difficult to penetrate the American consciousness with these ideas?
Yes,
Right.
right. I mean, I've become really very interested in the history of this whole field of nutrition and cancer research in particular, and often ask myself, why is it taking so long?
Right.
Because we had this information. That's another whole story. We had a lot of this information back in the 1800s. It was brilliant. It was fantastic for given us the resources they had. I've got 11 books, in fact, written by a gentleman in the middle 1800s who was a doctor until he was 41. He was a surgeon, a doctor, and when he was 41, he got to be age 41, he became a vegetarian. And then he wrote a total of 11 books. Eventually he was elected to the Irish Academy of Science. And these books are incredible. He's warning against going down the road of using pharmaceuticals in those days. He's suggesting that cancer, for example, is not the disease they thought it was. That is a local disease you could treat very specifically. It was a constitutional disease. So you're talking about a whole body. He was talking about holism. And he was writing these extraordinarily interesting texts.
But he wasn't able to connect with the public.
He got forgotten.
And so the idea is, I mean, I would presume that this gets into politics and money and all sorts of private interest and things like that sort of work together to kind of prevent certain kinds of awareness from penetrating.
It was during the advent of the Industrial Revolution. It really was. And so a lot of things were being invented, like the microscope, and being refined, and other kinds of instrumentation to spectrophotometric sort of instrumentation to be able to see things and concentrations and so forth and so on. Radioisotopes came into play in the late 1800s and were being used to track the course of nutrients and other things through the body. And I mean, there was some very powerful instrumental methods were coming to the fore, and people in science wanted to play with these things, and it was fascinating stuff.
Right.
So they ended up looking at individual things, individual nutrients, and all the rest.
So the birth of reductionism.
The birth of
in
reductionism.
medicine.
I've got a lot. I've written a long paper, actually, almost a book on this whole history, and I found some really amazing statements made during the 1800s and early 1900s. And the founder of the Cancer Society, the American Cancer Society, founded in 1913. He had already had a name for himself in the area of tuberculosis. He founded that society and advocated that one of the things this new society should do as far as cancer is concerned, pay some attention to nutrition, which is totally off the charts.
That's radical.
Yeah, and 3 years later, he's thrown off the board of the organization that he founded.
Wow.
And in 1922, 9 years later, they held the first national conference, international conference actually. Two of the presenters there were tasked with the idea of basically really criticizing this founder.
Interesting.
This stuff has been going on for a long time.
Right. And are these ideas that are going to be addressed in this documentary, or it's a sort of current context?
Not so
current
much
version of that.
The current content is more a derivative of that kind of thought. I wish I could tell you more, but we'll have to wait and see.
Right.
It's supposed to be out in September. I don't want to say
September. Oh, really? That's not that far off.
No, it isn't. Most of it's filmed, and but still, it's uncertain end.
Right.
And I don't want to overstep my bounds, and for that reason either, because the events of I don't see how what's about to transpire today is. I don't think it's going to hurt the film at all. But one never knows. The world is an unpredictable place.
That it is, and that is a perfect cliffhanger to conclude the conversation.
It's exciting.
So we will look forward with bated breath to September. We don't know what the title is yet, though.
It has a title. I'm not particularly fond of it, but myself, but others seem to like it for some reason. It's called Plant Pure Revolution.
Plant Pure Revolution.
I think it's
All
a
right.
mouthful. I'm not sure. It sounds a little bit academic. To some people, it sounds a little bit too provocative, I guess. I don't know. I was not prepared to say.
Right. All right.
I wish I could have if I had Howard Jacobson with me to come up with a title. I'm sure with all his metaphors and things like that, I'm sure
You
he'd
could
come up with
something better.
He'd come up with something.
Well,
better.
let's call it the working title. Maybe that will change by September.
whatever.
Right? All right. Well, Dr. Campbell, it was an honor and a privilege to sit down with you. Thank you very much. You are an inspiration. You're a gift to humanity, and I appreciate your work tremendously. And it's been fantastic to be able to spend a little time with you on this cruise.
I really thank you for this opportunity. It's fantastic. Your story is also so inspirational. It's beyond belief, I have to say. Number one. But number two, I just would like to add this little footnote. There was a famous study that was done in the early 1900s by a physiology professor at Yale University on the question concerning the role of a plant-based diet. He didn't call it that, on athletic performance.
No, I didn't know that.
Amazing results. Published in two books, one in, I think, 1905 and the other 1907, I believe. His name was Russell Chittenden, Chittenden. And he did it on himself first.
Right.
He started using this kind of diet, felt better than all the usual. Then he got some other fellow professors to join him to do this, and they felt better too. And then he worked on some young students who were coming into the ROTC program at Yale, getting trained for the next 6 months physically and otherwise. So he put them on a plant-based diet, essentially, not the diet they had come from home on, high in animal protein.
Right.
Stuff. Put them in. He put them through 15 strength and endurance tests at the beginning in October of that year. And came back in April, same test again. You could see the numbers swoop up, all of them. It was impressive when they went on this diet. He got criticized by his fellow colleagues. That would work. That's crazy. They improved because they were being trained. It had nothing to do with it. He said, fine. So he went out and got a couple of All-American athletes and really as he
They
says,
were already trained.
Already trained,
Right.
peak of their condition, as he called it. Their numbers were near the top. They were already at that level.
Right.
He put them on a plant-based diet and it just jumped way up.
Wow.
That was published at that time, and then
Can you still? I would love to read that. Is there a way?
I can get that information for you.
Yeah, I would love to be able to.
So
my
you're a
hands on
living
that.
proof of what he.
Right. So
he
what I'm
tried.
saying is nothing new. It's been
Well, I don't want to say that.
it's
You've
over
taken
100
it to,
years ago.
You've taken it to a whole new level.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think that what you have done and some other, obviously world-class athletes that I've come to know too, have just
There's some amazing athletes out there doing incredible things, and in no small part due to your tireless work. So it's
very
just
exciting.
beginning. It's just beginning.
just beginning. I
Yeah.
think so. I agree.
It's exciting times. I'm optimistic, and I think that there's a lot of work ahead for myself and for you, but it's very encouraging to see what's happening and to be, for example, on this boat and to have the experience of connecting with so many people that are having incredibly dramatic changes in their life by adopting this new perspective. And it's touching, and it's a life work that
It's fun.
is fun and meaningful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Peace.